You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Anthony Gregory is a Hoover Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He is also the author of New Deal Law and Order, How the War on Crime Built the Modern Liberal State, The Power of Habeas Corpus in America, and American Surveillance. He is a historian who has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, Brown University, and the Rhode Island School of Design. He joins me today to discuss his latest book, New Deal Law and Order, How the War on Crime Built the Modern Liberal State. Anthony, welcome to the Hayek Program podcast.
Nathan, it's so good to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining. So, your book focuses on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's law enforcement policies. Now, most historical treatments of FDR focus instead on either his economic policies, namely the New Deal, or his defense policy during World War II. So why is FDR's approach to criminal justice and law enforcement significant, and why has it been neglected by most other scholars who study FDR?
Well, it's significant in that the New Deal period gave rise to a major transformation, modernization of criminal justice policy pretty much across the board. It was a period where the federal prison system modernized, and you saw the creation of the first federal maximum security prison at Alcatraz. It was a period where the criminal code expanded at the national level like never before, and new laws targeted firearms and marijuana and so forth. It was a period where the FBI became a much more powerful, modernized institution with investigatory and arrest powers that it didn't previously have. And I would submit that not only was this period one of the most significant for criminal justice history, toward which the Roosevelt administration saw itself as having this important historical role, and that the Roosevelt administration approached this set of policies with not just a wide range of different strategies, but a sort of grand strategy, a holistic appreciation of the problem of crime and lawlessness. Not only was this a significant time for the policy history of law enforcement, I argue furthermore in the book that this transformation of criminal justice and law enforcement policy was important to the modernization of the American government itself, in the transformation of federalism and the ideology of modern liberalism that served to legitimize and support this state-building endeavor. Now, why has the policy history, as well as whatever its greater significance might be, been neglected or relatively ignored? Well, there are some fairly good reasons that the historiography focuses on the more narrowly understood economic policies of the New Deal. The Depression was one of the most significant crises in American economic history, and the levers of power that the Roosevelt administration pulled to address the Depression and to revamp the domestic state in its economic interventions, these were appropriately understood from the time they happened to the present as huge watersheds in American political history. And of course, World War II was, one could say, the most significant war in world history, and the Roosevelt administration presided over most of the United States' time in that war. So it's hard to compete with the rest of the Roosevelt legacy. But I do believe that there's another reason why it's taken a bit of time for historians and scholars to pay attention. There's a little bit of attention in the literature to Roosevelt's crime and criminal justice policies, but I'd say the main reason it hasn't found its way into the master narrative, or that there have been only a handful of focused studies on this at all. For one thing, there's the politics of it. I don't think that the historiography of the New Deal is political to the point where it's that we can't learn a lot from it, whatever you might think about the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration. But the association between the welfare state and the criminal justice state it's not one that is very convenient to most general political narratives of American government on left and right.
So that raises a really interesting question, which is one thing you talk about in the book is the entanglement between these welfare state policies and the criminal justice policies. So how did those develop in tandem? What were their interlocking features?
Well, that's another great question, and it's a big question. One thing that I stress in the book and in my other work or in the classroom when talking about the policy history of the United States is that the so-called welfare state and the other functions of the state that we kind of might more associate with this limited government ideal, of law and order, of policing, of punishment, these always were entangled in their mutual development. In the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, in the northern urban centers, particularly New York, the police department was one of the most significant social welfare institutions that was involved in just, trying to maintain baseline support for those in need. At the federal level, the huge changes that we see with the Civil War and Reconstruction, we could see a lot of the core instruments of the national security state have some origin there. We see the importance of the Secret Service becomes more important. The Treasury Department's law enforcers become more important. But at the same time, we have the Freedmen's Bureau, which arises in Reconstruction to bring about basic help to the freed Black Americans of the South. But the project of Reconstruction was also very much concerned with criminal justice jurisdiction and trying to enforce certain rights in the South. And with the New Deal period, or to skip ahead a bit, we see how, for example, since the prisons were an early foray for the federal government into areas that implicated social welfare and medicine, you see a lot of the criminologists, you see a lot of the reformers who are very much interested in criminal justice and crime and punishment, also interested in questions of social welfare. So on an intellectual academic level, there was always this important synergy between the two. And then I give more kind of concrete examples of how, for example, the Works Progress Administration, one of the paragon examples of New Deal political economy and the attempt to give jobs to those in need as well as to build up infrastructure. The WPA was involved in building up jails and prisons, but also it was involved in this national attempt to defend and to legitimize the institutions of rehabilitation, particularly at the state level, probation and parole. The WPA workers went around and collected survey data. So this is another one of these interpretations of American policy history that isn't particularly convenient for all sorts of different vantages in terms of politics. There are those who want to see the criminal justice state as part of the core mechanisms of government. And then later, as this narrative goes, the welfare state is affixed on top of it. And then there are others, mostly on the left, who see the 20th century welfare state as something that became deformed toward a nationalized war on crime later in the century. And I see that both of these attempts to disentangle the parts of governance that someone might like from the parts of governance that someone might dislike, I think that we have to be careful and understand how much different aspects of governance have arisen together.
So one theme that brings up this sort of entanglement between features of governance that people might like and features that people might dislike also comes up with regards to political philosophy here, right? So some classical liberal listeners of this podcast might look at FDR's rhetorical use of liberal ideas and say, well, he's not a genuine liberal. True liberalism is this 19th century phenomenon and 17th, 18th century phenomenon, and then the progressives stole the word. But you really emphasize the way in which liberalism of a sort was core to the legitimating rhetoric of the New Deal war on crime. So what role did liberal ideas play here, and how did FDR help transform liberalism in this way?
Well, it's commonly known that Roosevelt himself and the New Dealers saw themselves as part of this very deliberate and calculated redefinition of liberalism. They saw classical liberalism as well as progressivism before them as having important features of philosophy and important approaches to governance that they didn't want to abandon altogether, but they thought that these needed to be modernized. And Roosevelt was proud to call himself a liberal. And for the most part, he was effective in changing what Americans thought that word meant. And so for most of the, middle of the 20th century after the New Deal, when people called themselves liberals, they meant something more or less similar to New Deal liberalism, as opposed to so-called classical liberalism beforehand. And it is the case that you're absolutely right that a lot of people who are more fond of, the classical liberalism of the 19th century, or maybe even a radicalized kind of more idealistic version of it, something like when we think of 20th century classical liberals or 21st century classical liberals, I actually don't call them classical liberals. I usually I think of them as something like radical liberals, even if they're not full-blown libertarians or something of that nature. It is true that a lot of these critics, a lot of these thinkers don't believe that New Deal liberalism properly belongs within the category of liberalism. They see the illiberal elements of New Deal liberalism as disqualifying it, especially the support for the social welfare state and domestic regulation and the like. Now, why do I take a different approach? Well, for one thing, I'd say that the classical liberals also tended to have illiberal tendencies that would disqualify them in our current context. They tended to tolerate all sorts of illiberal behaviors by government. This was especially true in the 19th century because of federalism, because of the constitutional distribution of power between different jurisdictions. And so, for example, a lot of classical liberals were not in favor of Southern racial oppression. They thought it was wrong, but they didn't believe that the federal government could or should do that much to stop it. Or they might object to strike-breaking violence in certain cases. They'd say, this is strictly speaking illiberal. This is not part of my ideal. But the extent to which they would accept state violence against it at the local level, or they would kind of use the fact that the federal government was limited in what it could do on one side or the other. They would look at jurisdictional limits as one commitment of liberalism that might have overrode other commitments. And this speaks to the fact that liberalism always has been something of a constellation of different values that are in tension with one another. You can't actually be committed 100% to all of the implications of liberalism all at once, because there are tensions, especially when we bring jurisdictions in, when we bring in questions of private power and how private power interacts with state power, when we bring in questions of civil rights, when we look at the history of the United States or any place and how it has led to uneven distribution of power. And we see today how even many radical liberals and libertarians are willing to accept government interventions that they wouldn't accept before because they think they're necessary to tip the scales in defense of liberties that they think are being jeopardized. For example, we see this with questions of vaccine mandates and whether state governments ought to restrict businesses from mandating vaccines. Some people who see themselves as adherents to radical classical liberalism are much more situational in their commitments than they would have us believe. Now, that's part of why I would include them in liberalism, that I think even that even the classical liberals accept more illiberal compromises than they would want to believe. But there's another factor at stake, which is, as much as these critics, and I don't, it's kind of hard because who exactly are we talking about? But as much as many of us might be tempted to say, things that Roosevelt did with the National Recovery Administration, or certainly Japanese internment, all these things he did that clearly crossed the line, that makes him not a liberal anymore. Well, there's this whole question of compared to what? Compared to all of the other state mobilizing currents of the 1930s and the 40s, it's kind of striking how much the United States survived with some basic liberal values intact compared to almost all of Europe and Asia and so forth, right? The 30s were not a good time for classical liberalism. And I would say that even with all that the New Deal and the wartime Roosevelt administration did, if you care about civil liberties, free speech, which Roosevelt himself, however much you think he was honest about it or not, he said that he valued free speech, right? And he did compared to certain previous administrations. I'd say if you care about those core commitments, New Deal liberalism is somewhat recognizable as within the larger family of liberalism. And for further evidence of this, I would point out that if you look at political discourse today on let's look colloquially at electoral politics discourse, if you look at it in the 21st century, almost everybody that's very vocal on left and right will accuse the other side of being unprecedented in how authoritarian and threatening to freedom they are, right? People will say that, what Trump has done is beyond the pale. It goes beyond anything any president has done before. He's by far the most authoritarian president. And others on the other side say the same thing about Biden or Kamala Harris, how they represent some break with the freedom that America has long taken for granted. So which is it? Is America an essentially free country except for the extremists on the other side? If it is an essentially free country, then the New Deal revolution did not destroy the core liberalism of the United States. And I would submit that most people don't really believe that it did. Throughout American history, we could say that we've had a largely liberal political order and a largely liberal political ideology dominate, but always with some very extreme illiberal elements. But what makes American political history interesting is that core contradiction.
So getting into that tension in a bit more detail, let's talk a bit about how FDR's administration constructed this modern law and order, criminal justice, imprisoning, policing state. So one key element that you emphasize is what you call war on crime federalism. So what was war on crime federalism, and how did it differ from prior forms of federalism?
So war on crime federalism is the moniker I use to describe this cooperative federalism, this cooperative relationship between different scales of government during the New Deal to pursue lawlessness in its many forms. How does it differ from the past? Well, that's a great question. In fact, that I think accentuates what's special about it. In broad strokes, we could see federalism from the Civil War, certainly, or let's say Reconstruction, through the Progressive Era as a zero-sum game where national and state and local authorities are jealous of their power, and they see expansions of power if you're at the state level, you see national expansions of power as coming at the expense of your own power. We see this rivalry, right, over authority between national and state governments. In the 1920s, we had alcohol prohibition. And what I argue happened in the 20s is we have something we can call upside down federalism. And this zero-sum game becomes a negative-sum game, where alcohol prohibition actually offered many opportunities for new powers at the national and state governments. But to a large degree, the authorities at all levels of government, in many jurisdictions at least, didn't want this authority because it was not a desirable task to try to stop Americans from drinking. There was never enough public support to make such a crusade tenable. There was a lot of public support. That's how they got the 18th Amendment. That's how they banned alcohol during and then after World War I. But too many Americans believed in and engaged in the right to drink. It was a core belief of the Democratic Party and many of its constituents through the 19th century. It was also a problem for anyone who, after World War I, sought to have limited government. And the Republican administrations at the national level wanted to enforce prohibition, but they didn't want to expend too much energy into it. They blamed the state governments for failing to enforce it. Meanwhile, the state and local officials would dodge responsibility themselves. So we went from the zero-sum federalism of much of American history to the negative-sum game, where this power to enforce prohibition became a liability. It was like a game of hot potato. And what the war on crime in the New Deal did was it made federalism a positive-sum game, where the national and state authorities saw their own expanding power as mutually reinforcing. And the state governments indeed expanded. The police departments expanded. Governors throughout the country waged their own wars on crime, and the Roosevelt administration welcomed this, and they built new relations between the FBI and the police departments and the sheriff's departments. And there was just so much potential. There were so many things to do in the name of fighting crime that now everyone could have a seat at the table with different political philosophies, with different approaches to government. And they could all, at least for the time being, at least for a couple decades, they could all just see the expansiveness of their power on the horizon. And it was a great time for state building for almost everybody. So that's war on crime federalism.
So when it comes to constructing war on crime federalism, there were some key players that you identify that played a role. And one of them is Attorney General Homer Cummings. So who was Homer Cummings? What did he believe? And how did he influence public policy and public discourse around these topics?
Well, Homer Cummings, as you identify, he was Roosevelt's first attorney general, and he's one of these figures in American policy history that I think has been neglected in his importance. He was very much a liberal Democrat, including on economics. He was a very, very committed Democrat. He had a somewhat kind of progressive reputation when it came to trying to make sure that, the innocent people weren't put in prison. There were some high-profile examples of this. But he was a staunch believer in using all the levers of power against crime. And that included the welfare state. He believed adamantly in this project of crime prevention, where social workers would work with the police, with the federal government, with academics, and they would try to deal with the conditions that were thought to breed crime. They wanted to help out juveniles and so forth. He believed in punishing some criminals, and some he thought were so irredeemable that they had to be put in a prison and where they could never escape. And that it was his idea to do that at Alcatraz. But when it came to the constitutional and political history of the American government, he saw himself as one of these reforming liberals. He very much talked about liberalism as something that had to be updated, that had to be changed given the historical moment that they inhabited, the New Dealers. And he saw this with the Constitution as well. So he was one of the most significant figures in the New Deal government when it came to New Deal constitutionalism, when it came to defending the constitutional legitimacy of these new forays into welfare state policy, but also the war on crime. And he was able to bridge the New Deal liberals, including ones with very liberal attitudes about the welfare state. He was able to bridge them with the tough on crime conservatives that were part of what I call the War on Crime Coalition, most especially J. Edgar Hoover, whom he got along with better than some other liberal Democrats. So in terms of his, personal networking and his personal connections, as well as his very self-conscious role in building New Deal liberalism as this new updated vision for American governance, he was one of the, I'd say, most underappreciated figures of the period.
So you mentioned his relationships with J. Edgar Hoover, and both Hoover and also Anslinger were major officials in this process who had influential federal positions prior to Roosevelt's administration, are not necessarily people you think of as New Deal liberals when you're talking about this, but they retained their positions throughout this and became key players in the New Deal war on crime. So what role did each of these figures play? How did they get integrated into the new administration? And how did they then use that to expand the power of their respective domains?
Well, that's absolutely right. We associate correctly J. Edgar Hoover and Harry Anslinger of the Narcotics Bureau with the Roosevelt administrations that came, we associate them with the Republican administrations that preceded Roosevelt. And when Roosevelt came on, he retained them. That alone was a significant decision because there were liberal Democrats who were skeptical of J. Edgar Hoover, and there were certainly many who didn't like Harry Anslinger for all sorts of personal and political reasons. But then there were others who saw in Anslinger a lot of diplomatic expertise, and they valued him, and they urged Roosevelt to keep him on. And the same was true of J. Edgar Hoover. They both had bipartisan support, although they were both probably disliked more by liberals than by their fellow conservatives. But it was during the 30s that both of them achieved a permanence for their respective offices or their respective bureaus, as well as for their own personal power, that without which it's hard to imagine the mid 20th century unfolding the way it did. When Roosevelt came in, he was urged not to retain Anslinger, and there were several opportunities he had to get rid of Anslinger, but they kept him on, and it was ultimately Roosevelt that signed the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which we associate with Anslinger. And we see Anslinger, often he's depicted as this kind of right-wing rogue state builder who's responsible for the war on marijuana, despite it happening in the New Deal. But I argue that it was actually the war on marijuana that brought the New Dealers and the conservatives together in the 30s. And thanks to that law, Anslinger retains his power at the head of narcotics control in the federal government up through the early 60s. And J. Edgar Hoover retains his role in running the Bureau of Investigation through the early 70s. I mean, this is incredible. They both have these huge functions in building up the carceral state for decades. And at, I'd say, the most key moments when it came to their policy power, it was, in fact, the New Deal that modernized and made permanent their offices.
So, one thing that they both were known for as well, of course, was their respective positions on issues related to racial politics, right? Anslinger used racial rhetoric to foment fear surrounding marijuana. Hoover, of course, was somewhat infamous for his later use of the FBI to crack down on and surveil civil rights activists. And the racial politics of the New Deal war on crime are something that you pay a lot of nuanced attention to in the book, because it seems like a broad coalition with really diverse positions on racial issues was brought under one umbrella here. So how did that happen? How did FDR and Homer Cummings and other key players keep people with diametrically opposed views on issues of racial equality in their coalition?
Well, this is a great question, and it actually speaks to the bigger question at the heart of the New Deal coalition, and hence at the heart of 20th century American state building. The Democratic Party, out of the New Deal all the way through the 60s, is the main player in building up this gigantic American government and in revamping American, political ideology and having this huge effect not on the Republican Party as well. And at the heart of the puzzle, one that I think deserves a lot more attention, even beyond what I give it, is how do you do this? How do you have both white Southerners and other white Americans who were probably the most socially and culturally and racially reactionary or conservative in the same coalition with Black Americans and civil rights activists and so forth? Now, the white Southerners were part of the Democratic coalition since basically the middle of the 19th century, since the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so the question of why they leave the Democrats is one of these big contested and sometimes oversimplified puzzles in American political history. But during the New Deal, they're firmly in support of Roosevelt, especially the Deep South. In some of these states, basically like 97% of white Southerners are voting for Roosevelt. I mean, you can't imagine how popular he was in those circles. So he retains that base, but then Black Americans shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party over the course of the 30s. Basically, and of course, many of them couldn't effectively vote until the 60s. But among those who vote, we see about 1/3 of them are voting Democrat early in the Roosevelt presidency. And then by the late presidency, it's closer to 2/3 or more. So this is kind of the bigger question. And a lot of historians approach this quirky aspect of American political history by looking at labor policy or other promises that the Roosevelt administration was able to fulfill, or at least to pledge to both of these groups with very different ideas about the future of civil rights. I argue that law and order was a more central part of this puzzle than we've given it attention for. The fact is that although Black Americans would bear disproportionate burdens from the criminal justice system, especially in the longer term in the 20th century, for many Black Americans at the time, of course, the greatest crime, the greatest problem of lawlessness was racial terror, lynching. And at the national level, despite all of what the federal government did do to go after crimes and lawlessness, they didn't really do much about lynching. Now, by the time you get into the 40s, the FBI is investigating a little bit. And there are these other gestures that the New Dealers, especially Homer Cummings, they do, starting with Homer Cummings, they do give some gestures, some what I call these flashes of hope for Black Americans. They prosecute this man in Arkansas in 1936 for slavery, for manipulating outdated peonage policies and lying about having a contract with the government. And he basically forced Black men to work his land. He enslaved them. And it was the Cummings Justice Department that convicted him for this, that finally fulfilled this very baseline promise going back to the 1860s that the federal government wouldn't allow slavery. That got a lot of attention and support from Black Americans. Now, why didn't any of this undercut support among the kind of Jim Crow Democrats? Well, the federal government didn't go after lynching directly, and even many racist Americans, they didn't like lynching. And especially by this point, lynching had been seen as so disorderly and undercutting law and order at the local level. And even, racist Southerners who saw, policing and prisons as a more orderly form of maintaining order, including racial order, they didn't want the unwieldy presence of lynching, but they didn't necessarily want the national government to get involved either. So what's going on is through the 30s, liberalism is in flux, policy is in flux, and the constitutional federalism is also in flux, which allowed both Black Americans and their racially liberal allies, as well as the Jim Crow Democrats, to project different hopes upon the future of law and order. And for Black Americans, it wouldn't have taken that much to think now perhaps the federal government will be more on our side than in the past, because they had been so neglected. They had been so ignored. So it really was this remarkable balancing act that war on crime federalism allowed for the national government to send these conflicting signals. And it wasn't really until the 60s that we see the collapse of the New Deal coalition along racial lines. And what I believe happens is that by the time you get to the 60s, those conflicting projections on the future are finally not mutually sustainable anymore.
That makes sense. So it's a matter of people having a set of expectations and hopes, and you being able to appeal to each of those at once in some sense.
Yes. And, this wouldn't be the first or last time a a political campaign succeeds in holding together constituencies with mutually exclusive understandings of what the policy future will be. However, when it comes to, this central problem of racial oppression in American history, being able to maintain that balancing act allowed for the Democrats to have the most formidable political coalition probably in American history, and one that I don't think is possible to be rebuilt. When people think back, and anytime a Democrat wins the presidency, pretty much, we have to read through all of these think pieces about how maybe there'll be another New Deal. Now, when Biden won, he had such a marginal advantage in Congress. I thought that this was just fanciful, bizarre line of thinking. Under Obama, he at least comes in with 60 senators, but even that, it was a fantasy. The New Deal state, including the warfare state and the early Cold War state, everything that was built was possible because you had this huge coalition that Americans today can't wrap their minds around. I mean, you go into the Deep South and it's the Klan and, socialistic, labor activists, Black Americans in the same party. One thing I like to tell students when I teach the New Deal is imagine most of the vocal constituencies of MAGA and the resistance liberals in the same party. All those people, the intellectuals, the artists, the liberal, media journalists, organized labor, most Black Americans and civil rights activists, as well as, most of the basically both political parties today have huge swaths of what used to be the New Deal coalition, or what would have been the New Deal coalition. And most of the people who are most vocal about supporting one side or the other would have primarily all been New Dealers at one point. And that's a difficult coalition to recreate, and it was a formidable coalition to confront.
Yeah, that's really striking. Now, one thing that enabled them to mobilize that coalition and to use that to consolidate power in various ways was the perception of crisis, right? And that's clear in the context of the New Deal, with the Depression being an economic crisis, and it's clear in the context of World War II. Was there also a way that perceived crises played a role in building up war on crime federalism, or was that something that was less crisis-oriented?
Well, lawlessness was, in a way, the constant crisis in American political life and discourse going back to Reconstruction. After the Civil War, there's a lot of disorder and chaos and violence in the South. There's a lot of crime, and there are attempts by after as Reconstruction basically falls violently to white terror, and then white supremacists in the South seek to build up the institutions of law and order in a highly racialized way, to say the least. But this doesn't actually effectively deal with the crime, including among white Southerners. The Wild West, so-called, I know it's contested in the literature just how violent it was per capita, but it was certainly contributing to the impression that violence was the norm in American society. In the North, you had industrialization, you had social dysfunction, you had riots, you had race riots as well, but you had a lot of class stratification. You had crackdowns on workers, violent crackdowns by officials at all levels of government and as well as privateers. And you had corruption, and everyone knew it. Both political parties accused the other of corruption, and they were both mostly correct. That it was just the degree of corruption was unbelievable, even by modern standards. Though today people today talk about how we've never had as corrupt a government as X, Y, or Z, but we certainly did back in the day. And the progressive reformers, just like they thought they had solutions to all the other problems, they wanted to address lawlessness from the top down. They wanted to reform every household, every neighborhood, every police station. And they did some reforms that actually did clean things up, but their ambitions far outstripped their capacity to fulfill them, because in part, well, for a lot of reasons, as an economist, I'm sure you could explain some of it, but other reasons were ideological. Most people weren't progressives. They saw them as, they would win the national elections. We think of those presidents from Teddy Roosevelt through Wilson, at least, as progressives, but progressivism was a largely middle class kind of set of values that didn't really speak to the working class or the agricultural workers or some of the rich. And constitutional tradition also greatly restrained what the progressives could do. And then once you get to prohibition, which was really, in a way, their most ambitious idea that finally gets fulfilled, let's try to ban alcohol nationwide. And it was a catastrophe that just led to more black markets and more violence and more corruption. By the time you get to the Depression, you had this multi-generational problem of lawlessness, as many Americans saw it, accentuated by prohibition. And then you had, after Roosevelt got elected, there was an assassination attempt. And there had been assassination attempts in the past. Teddy Roosevelt had been shot. If Franklin Roosevelt had died, he would have been the fourth president since the 1860s to be assassinated. So there was political violence. So yes, the idea that crime was at a crisis level, it wasn't as important. I don't want to pretend it was quite as important as the Depression in Americans' mind, but it was probably second. And when Roosevelt came into office, he was inundated with letters saying we need national police force, we need martial law. There was this movie that came out, Gabriel Over the White House, that depicted this like dictator president who comes in and he had been like a do-nothing president as Harding or Hoover had been imagined to be, but then he makes talk about Roosevelt being a liberal. This is why a lot of Americans cheered this American dictator on the silver screen who suspends Congress, declares martial law, summarily executes organized criminals, and organized crime and gangsterism had gotten much worse. Racketeering. You had these bandits. You had kidnapping, which was terrorizing, the middle of America. And by the early 30s, you had, of course, all these larger than life figures. You had your Bonnie and Clyde, you had your John Dillinger, and all of it came together to, I'd say, amount to a crisis, but not this immediately new thing. It was more of a mounting problem that finally the New Dealers addressed in a novel and more permanent way.
That makes a lot of sense. We have this ongoing, decades-long perceived crisis. There are attempts to resolve it, but they fall prey to certain incentive incompatibilities, conflicts between different levels of government, and then these sorts of political entrepreneurs discover ways to make this a mutually beneficial exchange between the federal government as well as state and local authorities and between different factions that they can bring together into a coalition to successfully implement this war on crime. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's spoken with an economist's efficiency. No, that's exactly right. That was a great way of putting it.
Awesome. And so One other thing that winds up playing a important role in state building is, of course, that war is the health of the state, as Randolph Bourne said. So what role did the national security state play in the construction of this more domestic security state?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up too, because as I talk about in the book, the first two chapters have this background history, and the second one is about starts with World War One. The New Dealers were very much living in the shadow of World War One still. And World War One had allowed in very particular ways these new state building exercises, including prohibition, which of course lasted until about a year into the New Deal. But the World War One security state was, for the most part, not sustained, because it was such a panicked and rapid buildup of mobilization. The American government, even through the peacetime progressive era, was rather small by today's standards and by the 1930 standards, even by the 1920 standards. World War I was, of course, this huge ratcheting opportunity for the government to grow, but it grew so quickly and in such a kind of an overzealous manner when it came to domestic security that it wasn't sustained, and much of it collapsed. Particularly, it relied for domestic surveillance and for cracking down on dissent. It relied on these partnerships with vigilante and quasi-vigilante groups, right? The federal government had used these kind of constitutionally innovative relationships with private enforcers in the past. But World War I brings this into stark relief. You had groups like the American Protective League, which enforced the draft, enforced military conscription during World War I. And how did they do it? Well, they'd identify people, young men, that they thought were dodging the draft. They called them slackers. And they would grab them and they'd throw them into vans and they'd corral them into stadiums and they would torment them and hit them. And, they would accuse them of dodging the draft, these slackers. And they'd round up over 100,000 men this way. Something like 98% of them were not draft dodgers. So they had like an incredibly, their false positive rate, was ridiculous. It was like, it's almost comic. It's almost unbelievable how much of a disgrace this was. And everyone was embarrassed by it. There were hearings. And after World War I, there was this commitment. There was this fear about vigilantism. And after World War I, there was also this Red Scare, right? The panic about Germans and German sympathizers shifted pretty quickly after the Bolshevik Revolution, especially to fear about communists. And the fear about anarchists never went away. But the fear about radicals led to this first big Red Scare after World War I. And that, too, was seen as disreputable because it largely harassed a bunch of mostly peaceful people, and they would predict that there'd be bomb plots, and they didn't come out of it. And then this, combined with prohibition, led to this deep distrust of the security apparatus. In the 1920s, the Bureau of Investigation was kind of a joke. And those that tried to enforce prohibition were seen as a joke. And, if anything, the lawbreaker was romanticized in the media in fiction. Americans have long romanticized lawbreakers. Americans have always been really into both sides of the law and order fight. We love an anti-hero and we love a hero. And it wasn't really until the New Deal that they were able to achieve this public relations accomplishment of making the G-men, of the Bureau of Investigation's men, professionalized and also seen as the good guys. And the bad guys, the criminals, were finally seen as a much of a nuisance. They were no longer just supplying, you with bootleg alcohol. They were terrorizing the country. And so the shadow of World War I was a paradox because it offered opportunities for mobilization, material, institutional, and ideological, but it also served as this major cautionary tale and embarrassment in the way that the security apparatus had to rely on informants and vigilantes. And in World War II, and well, starting in the New Deal, as I argue, the professionalization and move away from this vigilante relations are crucial to why the World War II security state never went away. There's a ratchet, but it's not the same kind of ratchet as after World War I.
So to get a bit more concrete, what sorts of coercive powers were built up during World War II, and especially on the home front with this domestic law and order security state? How did the World War II war economy intersect with the New Deal war on crime?
Well, that's a great question. A lot of it is, as I attempt to show, there's this continuity where in the couple years before the U.S. enters World War II, the United States is already moving toward a security posture. And this is a commonly understood story when it comes to surveillance or when it comes to foreign aid, when it comes to Roosevelt's establishment of the first peacetime draft. The U.S. is getting in this wartime footing by the time we're in, the 1940s, before Pearl Harbor. But the cooperative relationship between the Bureau of Investigation and the police departments that had been nurtured through the 30s is in a way consecrated in World War II, because there's for example, there's this fingerprint relationship. There's this huge fingerprint database that they're building up. And the local law enforcers have access to it in that if they find prints, they give the prints to the federal government, and the federal government helps them track down who the prints might belong to and so forth. And this gives all the states and localities a new investment into a more nationalized security apparatus that proves effective. And it proves, somewhat effective. Fingerprinting forensics are actually among, to this day, the most reliable and effective technology. So it was quite something for them to make such gains with this forensic technology at the time. But not only are they invested in that technology and that new relationship, but the police are and sheriffs are all told by the national government going into World War II and during World War II that they're as important to national defense as the soldiers, right? And this kind of militarization of society, while maintaining a kind of civic institutionalism in domestic law and order, World War II, finally allows for the full expansion in material resources and the fulfillment of this relationship. And after World War II, of course, there's no one thinks there should, ever be any reason to go back. I mean, I shouldn't say nobody, but for years, local police were skeptical of national police, but now all of a sudden they see themselves as fully invested, and vice versa. And it's like this mutual admiration society that really was effective in some cases, going after wartime kind of offenses. But, after World War II, then of course, soon enough, the Cold War, they just never go back. So that's one example. The way that Frank Murphy, Homer Cummings' successor as Attorney General, he wants the FBI to be able, in the case of war, to wage a two-front war at home against criminals as well as domestic subversives who are, subversives or, agitators who are actually a threat to national security, He wants to go after them as well as to kind of defend the national security of the United States.
So it seems like throughout all of this, we see a move from federalism checking power against power to a type of federalism where the power of one center of authority is used to mutually reinforce the power of another center of authority. Do you think that's a fair characterization of the transformation that occurred here?
I do. And I think this is more of I think there's more to that kind of cooperative federalism in American history than is sometimes understood. I'd say there are examples of this in the early republic as well. But the reason it's so so important in this case is that, especially from the mid 19th century, through the highly regionalized conflicts of the Civil War and Reconstruction, all the way through Prohibition, the material opportunities for government to grow, thanks to industrialization, have never been as great. And yet the friction in federalism is also perhaps never been great. And in fact, I'm kind of thinking aloud here with you, but it's possible that the way we think of federalism as largely a distribution of power that builds on tension rather than cooperation, this is, again, I'm just workshopping this with you. It's possible that this was largely a 19th century, and particularly late 19th century, framework for federalism. Of course, in the early 19th century, there were a lot of disputes and the nullification crisis, but it was a lot more complicated in the regional implications because of fugitive slave enforcement, and you had unionists throughout the country as well. So yeah, I would say that the kind of cooperative, mutually beneficial form of federalism that the war on crime builds on in the 30s is highly important throughout the 20th century and to this day, with criminal justice policy in particular. We're seeing examples of we saw with immigration enforcement and with the marijuana raids. We definitely saw conflicts between the national and the state, or the national and the local, in recent decades. But in general, I would say law and order and law enforcement are areas where the different levels of government cooperate better than in other areas of domestic policy. There is a literature on the cooperative federalism of the welfare state from the New Deal to the Great Society. And a lot of scholars, although I haven't really scrutinized this very carefully, a lot of scholars argue that in the late 20th century, we see this cooperative federalism break down. But what I would contend is, when you think of cooperative federalism and the war on crime, the 80s, the 90s, the war on terror, those were great decades for the cooperation between different levels of government when it came to military hardware, domestic surveillance, and the like.
So we keep talking about this as a sort of mutually beneficial exchange, and I think that's right. But one thing that I don't want to lose sight of is that there's significant negative externalities of this mutually beneficial cooperation between different political officials on those who are surveilled, incarcerated, policed, and so on. Could you talk a little bit about some of those effects on those who are coerced by the state that was built up during the New Deal?
Well, so one of the challenges that one might have in looking at my book is that a lot of these externalities, as you put it, or a lot of the human costs of the security state, the carceral state, the liberal state itself, that are all built up in the 30s and the 40s, a lot of this seems to become clearer later in the century, and I don't really talk that much about it. And I'm a little bit reluctant to pin all of that on the 30s and 40s, just insofar as there were contingencies that allowed for the permanence of the state that I describe the origins of to maintain in the later 20th century. In other words, I think I am talking about an origin story, but I don't want to imply an inevitability between the New Deal war on crime and the state it builds through the Cold War and to the present. There's definitely collateral damage. I mean, the fact that the United States by the end of the 20th century has, at least on a per capita basis, I believe the largest carceral state incarceration rate in the world. One doesn't have to have a firm opinion about the guilt or innocence about many of the people caught up or the nature of the victimless crimes that ensnared many in the system. You can have all kinds of opinions on that and yet look at that and say that is a pretty horrific institutional reality for the so-called land of the free. The surveillance state has definitely been weaponized over the decades against many different political factions. For a long time, it went after those coded as being on the left or anti-war, or the new left, or those thought to be socialistic or communistic. But it also went after the far right and other conservative opponents of the liberal politicians through the 20th century. And we've seen today the suspicion about the FBI or surveillance, kind of the partisan coding of that suspicion shift from left to right. So today, conservatives are much more skeptical of the FBI than liberals are. So, and that's certainly not good for the democratic or constitutional health of the country for surveillance to be politicized. Those who do seek a more constitutionally limited government have to contend with just how far from that vision the modern wars on crime have taken us. The war on drugs has deformed the American constitutional order. It's pretty much impossible to have a robust kind of Fourth Amendment protection of privacy, including property rights, and have kind of unending crusades against possession crimes, whether that be drugs or firearms. There's a lot we could talk about that takes us afield from the research in the book, just about how the last 70 or 80 years of American policy history has been shaped so much by demands on the law and order state that have, as in the past, pushed it beyond its capacity to enforce the law in anything approaching an even or humane manner. I don't know what else I could say. The costs were there at the beginning too, no doubt. In the 30s, as the prison population grows a bit, we see, more and more people in prison, including for offenses that I'm sure they weren't all guilty of, and including offenses that many of us would find not proportionally dealt with through criminal justice.
So pivoting a little bit to the sort of research methods that you used for the book, you looked at a lot of archival sources in your research for this book. So I'm curious what that process looked like, what doing that kind of archival research looks like, and if you have any advice for people who want to do this sort of historical research in order to look at processes of institutional change.
Well, that's another big question. This grew out of my dissertation, and I had written books in the past, but the books I had written in the past, though they were generally historically minded, legal history and including some constitutional history, they were what we call largely synthetic works, based mostly on other published sources and generally other works of scholarship. Whereas this book, New Deal Law and Order, is primarily based on primary sources and archives. And I went to archives throughout the country, mostly on the West and East coasts. I hit a bunch of Bay Area archives, the Hoover Institution at Stanford, the Berkeley's Bancroft Library, some San Francisco collections, San Jose, and then on travel trips, I went to the National Archives in DC, which is quite an amazing place. The one in College Park, I recommend anyone interested in history to visit, because it's quite an experience just to be there. Roosevelt's papers in Hyde Park in New York, the Anslinger's papers in Pennsylvania. UVA has Cummings's papers. So yeah, I went to a whole bunch of archives, some papers at the Atlanta National Archives, where I did my research on the Tennessee Valley Authority's security forces. That was very interesting. And the whole time, what I really tried to do was, as much as I could, approach this project inductively with an open mind. I wanted to read, I read the secondary literature as best I could before, but I wanted to see what the sources told me. The book probably will be interpreted by some, especially if they don't read it, to be a kind of just forensic indictment of the New Deal. Like, aha, look at how the liberals are responsible for the war on crime. Now, those who like the carceral state or law and order, they might think that it's an attempt to vindicate the New Dealers for being tough on crime. And depending on the politics of the moment, liberalism will be more or less associated with prosecutors and police and so forth. But I really don't think the project reads that way. And, while I will admit to having, especially in my younger years, a very critical outlook on both the New Deal and on the war on crime and the carceral state. I've been on record being a critic of the state. In a strange way, reading this or doing all the research I did and writing this has made me a little bit softer on the crime warriors and the New Dealers. Or I see that working within the context that they were, and this might come through in the fact that I include them in the great liberal tradition, just like a lot of other people that I'm critical of, but don't want to demonize. I can see how lawlessness of the sort that Americans have often faced in the past is an actual social problem. And the New Dealers were trying to navigate a time where most states, as I mentioned earlier, opted for far more authoritarian means of mobilization. And if we're grading on the curve, it could have been worse. And that's kind of my approach to history, is you got to grade everyone on the curve. So when I was doing all the archival work, I'd really like to think of myself as the kind of scholar who is at least as happy when I find something that I can't explain or that runs against the narrative I have in my head, as I am when I find something that just reinforces my priors. In fact, that's why I'm a historian. I think history is interesting because it's not just the vindication of theory. It can't be replaced by theory. History shouldn't just be cherry picking evidence to make a relatively simple explanation of the world seem like more airtight. Rather, the purpose of history is to show that you need to understand the story to see the complexities and the nuances, the paradoxes of the human condition. And I think that those come through in the archives. This was definitely by far my most involved research project, probably by an order of magnitude at least, in terms of how much reading and work I had to do for it. But I think that there's something about looking at the archives that you can't replicate through any other means of trying to understand the world.
Awesome. Well, those nuances really shone through in the book, I think. I think it's a very impressive work of history. I learned a lot from it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me about it. Is there anything that you'd like to add or that you think is important for listeners to take away that we haven't had the chance to cover so far?
Oh, I've definitely I've definitely given you my share of circuitous answers, but I do just want to reiterate what I take to be the importance of history, but also reading across disciplines. I think that historians need to read more social science. They need to read at least the economists that they're able to understand, as well as political scientists and other social scientists. But I also think that social scientists should read lots of history. And we shouldn't take for granted the world that we occupy as it is. And again, I want to stress that there are things we might like about that world that are intertwined historically with things we don't like. And I want us to work toward being comfortable with grappling with that contradiction.
Thanks so much. I think that's a really important point. I think both the call for multidisciplinary research and a broad base of knowledge and understanding, as well as grappling with the real tensions in the world and the complexity of social institutions and social processes, is really important for scholars in all disciplines to take away. Anthony Gregory, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Nathan. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.